Hey everyone, Synchrony here. I am here to talk about the living story today, as always. And in particular, I want to bring up a theory that I've kind of been working on, putting together a lot of different pieces of evidence just related to Scarlet, and a few really interesting things came up, which I think are relevant now, especially considering the recent kind of hints that have been dropped both in-game and through ArenaNet, that Primordus might be involved in some of the upcoming content. And so today what I'm going to talk about is the inclusion of Primordus in Scarlet's plans. And the way that I'm framing it is Scarlet as a champion of Primordus. Okay, so what this entire theory, what this whole video is going to be about is basically if Scarlet was a champion of Primordus, this is how it all went down. This is how she went from the beginnings of Scarlet through the alliances, through the Nightmare Tower, what we're into right now, and how it's going to finish up. So that's basically how I'm going to go through it. It's sort of like if she was a champion of Primordus, this is how. Okay, so we're going to go through a lot of different steps from all the way in the beginning. We're going to see hints through the personal story and the living story that kind of hint at this. Some of the stories that were presented by ArenaNet, all these things, and we're going to see how they're all connected. So just a little quick outline, I'll put it on the screen. We're going to go through a lot of different topics, and I'll try to really break it down. I'm going to make it as accessible as possible, but you kind of have to maybe do a little bit of searching yourself, especially if you've been away from the living story. It might not make as much sense as if you were participating. Okay, first we're going to start with a recap of Scarlet's story, her origins, what she went through, her vision, and then her time, and then the building of the alliances, and then leading up to where we are now, just to kind of catch up, remind everyone about what happened, and maybe for the people who weren't there for all of it, maybe little pieces they missed. Then a little mini disclaimer from me about this theory, just my own sort of investment in it or whatever. Then an introduction to Primordus, just the history of Primordus for anyone who doesn't quite know. Then I'm going to go through some reasons to entertain this idea, some very superficial, kind of obvious reasons, hints, very major hints that have been dropped in-game and out of game for why to even consider Primordus to be at all a factor in all of this. I'm going to acknowledge some immediate concerns, mainly that the connection between Salvarian dragons, how that works out. Then I'm going to talk about why and how Scarlet was chosen. That's kind of a combination of Primordus' own motives and what he's been trying to do, and hints from the personal story, especially from this. And then also how Scarlet was chosen. How is it that a dragon can access a Salvarian, things like that. Very sort of theoretical stuff going on there. Then we're going to dive into the nature of draconic leylines. What is the nature of magic in Tyria, and how do these forms of magic interact in interesting or dangerous ways? The Thaumanova head explosion. What is Scarlet's vision all about? What happened there to make her corrupted with Primordus' magic and Primordus' recruitment of Scarlet through her vision? And then we're going to talk about all the content that we've been experiencing, all the alliances and all that stuff, and what they were all for. Finally, we're going to talk about the big finale. What is this all leading up to? What is the end goal for Scarlet, and how is it going to finish? And then I'm going to highlight some of the limitations of the theory. Every theory is going to have limitations, especially here where we don't have the complete picture at all. We're trying to make these connections, and in some areas we have to speculate, and we have to just kind of acknowledge the limitations that we have, and then hopefully we can fill in the blanks kind of as a community, or just at least we'll know where we need to look for the upcoming content. And then lastly, just a recap of everything I said, and a wrap-up of what we can expect in the future. All right, and probably before we start, it's probably a good idea, I'm going to explain as much as possible, but if you find that you're not catching on to some of the words or some of the places that I'm talking about, some of the concepts or things like that, you should check out the wiki for these terms. I'm going to put them on the screen. There are going to be a few sort of key terms that you might want to look into, either before we start or just some to keep in mind if you want to follow up and check them out later, or some of the events that I'm going to be talking about, you can read the whole description on the wiki for those personal story events, for example. Alright, before I dive in, I have to give a huge shout out to Steven on the forums. We've been chatting on the forums, we've been chatting in-game, kind of bouncing ideas back and forth. I presented him with some of the details of this theory, and with his feedback and through our conversations, a lot of points organically came up that I'm involving here. So just a huge shout out to him, because he helped me really refine these ideas into what this theory is right now. Okay, so let's start by recapping Scarlet's story. Scarlet was born with the name Ciara, extremely curious and independent. I'll use the names Ciara and Scarlet interchangeably here because they are the same person. Alright, so after spending time in the Grove, she went on a journey through which she learned from the best minds and craftsmen in all of Tyria. She was extremely talented at everything she did. Eventually she went to Radasum and studied at the 3 colleges there. She mastered statics and dynamics very quickly, and then spent more time in synergetics. This was the level of study that she was most interested in, and she became increasingly interested in the eternal alchemy, which she believed was a key to traversing space and time. Anyway, she later joined up for the Inquest for a while, and was shortly kicked out of Radasum for tampering with the Invention archives. Eventually, Scarlet's mentor at Radasum, named Ahmad, found her and convinced her to come back for another experiment. Remember, they were really heavily invested in the study of the eternal alchemy. He had created a coffin-like chamber that Scarlet would be strapped into, and through various innovative principles of synergetics, they'd be able to see and experience the eternal alchemy. Then during the experiment, when Scarlet was strapped in and it was powered up, Scarlet had a vision. We're not exactly sure of the extent of what she saw, but something happened, and when she re-emerged, she had changed from Ciara to what we now know as Scarlet. Now, this was all before we even met her. It turns out that, since last year, she was responsible for coordinating the Molten Alliance and the Aetherblade Sky Pirates. Then, when we finally encountered her, was at the Queen's Jubilee, where she turned the Watchwork Knights into the Twisted Watchwork monsters. And she was wreaking havoc on Divinity's Reach, all that stuff. And then most recently, Scarlet introduced the Toxic Alliance and the Tower of Nightmares, and in that tower she somehow merged together Crate and other creatures to produce an extremely powerful hybrid. We ended up defeating this new monster, and eventually destroyed the tower. That's where we are now. So all of that is kind of Scarlet's story, just a very brief, broad recap of what happened. If you want more details, you should check the wiki for the What Scarlet Saw story, and also you can check out the content releases and stuff like that if you want a little bit more information about each patch and how the contributions of each alliance and what they did there. Alright, so just a little mini disclaimer. I know it sounds odd to include Primordus and Scarlet's campaign, and I actually share others' cynicism for the idea. It is kind of hard to believe. However, when looking at all the data and taking all of the information available at hand, a very plausible connection arises. Now, with anything, with the amount of evidence and kind of stories that we have, the rich lore that we have in Guild Wars, a lot of stories can be put together and connected, and this is one of them. This is sort of like, here's all the information, and here's my interpretation, and it happens to include Primordus, and I think you'll see that it's more than just a weak connection. Okay, so if that's the story, how does Primordus fit in? There was nothing there that had anything to do with dragons or just anything like that. Okay, Scarlet as a lieutenant of Primordus. Now, I'm going to use lieutenant, general, champion, kind of all interchangeably. So, sorry if that bothers you, but that's just kind of how I'm going to do it. Just some history about Primordus. For those that don't know, Primordus is an elder dragon. He was the first known elder dragon to awaken a few hundred years ago from deep underground. And he would have awoken sooner, but the humans were able to stall this awakening by vanquishing his general at the time, known as the Great Destroyer. This was in Guild Wars 1, Eye of the North. His minions, called Destroyers, are usually composed of rocks and lava, which are the general elements attributed to Primordus. Usually, Primordus composes his minions out of rocks and lava and sort of molten fire, things like that. And they're always kind of out of inanimate materials. It's rare that he'll corrupt a sentient being. Since Primordus' territory is deep under the earth, his whereabouts at any given time are unknown, and his free reign down there makes him the most mobile of all the Elder Dragons. So we really don't know where he is, and he can be really anywhere. Okay, so I want to give just a few reasons for anyone who kind of walks in doubting, which is a lot of us, myself included, I promise. Just some reasons to entertain this as a plausible idea to begin with. There are certainly some obvious hints at Primordus throughout the living story, both in-game and sort of meta ArenaNet announcements. First, we have the Do Not Touch towers, now called mysterious probes. They seem to be doing something to the ground. Whether it's simply measuring something or sending a signal is irrelevant at the moment, but it certainly feels very Primordus-y, sort of Primordus-esque, with all the fire and the ground. It's kind of hard to not link those up. Second is ArenaNet's announcement about the conclusion of the story arc supposedly rocking Tyria to its core. That's something that's been thrown around a lot in the forums, on Reddit, whatever. This undeniably has a Primordus feel to it, right? And then finally, the soundbite released of Scarlet saying something like, "Be afraid of dragons." So then again, another connection to dragons. If you've been in the game at all, you have to have at least seen those Do Not Touch towers. And then if you've been sort of on Reddit at all or in the forums at all, you've probably heard a little bit about the other two. So these are some of the more obvious hints that we see. Now, I said we're talking about this theory as Scarlet being a champion of Primordus. I want to, before I really dive into all the details of the theory, I have to acknowledge the glaring hurdle that stands in the way of even bringing up this framework. In particular, I'm talking about the idea that Sylvari cannot be corrupted by dragons. That's a rule that we accept as true, that Sylvari cannot be corrupted by dragons. I'm going to argue that Scarlet is a very special and unique case. I'll provide a workaround for this issue. I just wanted to make sure that I at least acknowledge that from the start so people don't feel like they're spending a bunch of time without having such a major issue addressed. I will talk about that, and I'll go into some details about how that could have happened. Okay, so why Primordus and why Scarlet? What are the motives of Primordus that then dictate the motives of Scarlet? And why did he choose her over producing his own minion or anyone else around Tyria? Well, to figure this out, a lot of our information actually comes from the personal story. To start the theory, we first have to establish a motive for Primordus. Why would he make the effort to recruit Scarlet as a lieutenant? I'm claiming here that Primordus is planning a major campaign against Tyria. And in order to carry out this campaign, he needs a lieutenant to amass a powerful army to do the heavy lifting. This is how Zhaitan handled his business as well. We see champions of Zhaitan carrying out major operations in the personal story. Primordus similarly needs a competent and powerful being to handle these things. Now, he's not just looking for a powerful minion. Minions are thoughtless followers. Primordus needs a leader. And these leaders, these lieutenants, these generals, these champions, have a very different profile than just a minion. To think that Primordus would only just make another great destroyer or another giant minion out of rocks and lava doesn't fit with necessarily the profile of a lieutenant or a general. If you go to Frostgorge Sound at Earthshake Basin, this is where a lot of people go when they want to go fight Claw of Jormag. In that camp at Earthshake Basin, there is a priory scholar named Arcanist Fen. And Arcanist Fen describes the characteristics of Elder Dragon lieutenants. Keep in mind, you only get this conversation if you're with the Order of Whispers, so if you're not with the Order of Whispers, you don't get these dialogue options. He says, with regard to lieutenants, aside from their superior strength, they're quite different from the standard corrupted minion. Lieutenants are hand-picked by the dragons. They're not mindless drones, but intelligent killers, and they have the power to corrupt living beings. So we see lieutenants or champions, they're not mindless drones, they're not just minions, and they're intelligent killers. Also, they can corrupt living beings, but we'll come back to that last point later. Okay, so Primordus is planning a campaign, and he needs a strong and competent general. And another thing, not only is Primordus planning a campaign, But as he produces new minions, that is, as he's making destroyers out of rock and lava and all these things, and corrupting those materials, he's also experimenting with alternative forms of corruption. So as he's planning his attack, he's also developing new ways to corrupt and build armies. One such example of alternative corruption? Well, not simply corrupting a mature being, as a dragon usually would, but instead corruption from birth. In a personal story arc where you're a Skrit sympathizer, you're called to vanquish a destroyer queen in the Harathi hinterlands, the northwest corner called the Feral Dens. It's a little Skrit scratch where a destroyer queen comes up. Normally this wouldn't be a big deal. A destroyer queen, okay, it's a minion of Primordus, great, we kill it. However, there's something extremely important about this queen. She hatched corrupted minions. The corrupted queen laid eggs, and from those eggs came out corrupted destroyer hatchlings. Okay, that simply does not happen, okay? Corrupted minions cannot breed. That's just not something that happens. The Order agents all say that this is a new discovery for minion corruption. And in this case, it appears that Primordus is trying to produce minions through incubation. You know, eggs to be hatched. However, this clearly proves to be an insufficient method of corruption because the hatchlings emerge in such a weak state. You know, we as player characters are able to kill them very fast because they're just not very strong. So Primordus at least has the birthing part right, but the newborn corrupted minions are born simply too weak to fight or do anything useful. So then if he's innovating new ways to corrupt, his next step then is to get a general that can handle this operation. Get a general that can handle this new form of corruption, corruption from birth, corruption from incubation. Find a way to mass produce minions through incubation that come out strong and ready to fight. I hope some wheels are starting to turn in your head right now. Think about the Tower of Nightmares and the Toxic Hybrid, okay? Scarlet now fits all the qualities of a lieutenant, except for the ability to corrupt. That's what she's been working toward this entire time. Finding a way to essentially breed powerful corrupted minions through an incubation process, similar to what we saw in the Tower of Nightmares. The next step is to find a way to instill corruption into the minions, somehow corrupt them, indoctrinate them into Primordus's hold. So that's why Scarlet is involved. All these things, all these alliances, all the stuff, you know, just everything now fits into this get everyone together in order to produce these new minions for Primordus. By examining the motives of Primordus, we get a much clearer set of motives for Scarlet. Scarlet is a general of Primordus, albeit an unconventional one, as she relies heavily on technology to accomplish her tasks. It's not simply out of magic, where she sort of waves her hands and someone is corrupted. It's more of a technological feat that she's able to work as a general of Primordus. Okay, that's kind of an overview of what the motives are and how we want to kind of frame. That's kind of the perspective that we're taking when we're thinking about all these things in this Living Story Season 1. And it really helps to put a lot of the events that we've experienced so far into perspective. But there's still so much mystery surrounding the moment of corruption. How is it that Ciara turned into Scarlet? What was happening? What did she see in her vision? What happened during her vision that led to her corruption? That's a very real concern that needs to be addressed if we're going to take this theory seriously. You can't just say, especially with the history of Sylvari cannot be corrupted, we have to come up with a very convincing and plausible way for this to happen. And Scarlet drops a lot of these hints on her own through the Living Story, and the Thomino Reactor contributes to a lot of these ideas. And really, we're talking about the draconic ley lines. We're talking about the nature of magic on Tyria, how different forms of magic merge, intertwine, the consequences of this merging, of the merging of these different kinds of magic. So I've described the motives of Scarlet's plans, but it's still unclear how she became a lieutenant of Primordus. As I try to explain the way in which Scarlet was corrupted, I have to elaborate on the nature of magical leylines in Tyria. And when I say leylines, I'm talking about the streams of magic that run throughout Tyria. Run throughout the world, rather. It may feel like we're off the topic at hand when we talk about these leylines, but it's simply critical to establish the nature of magic on Tyria if we want to understand the large-scale story progression. So think back to the fractured patch, actually in the Thama Nova fractal. In the story mode, Scarlet revealed, or confirmed, that there are channels or streams of magic all around Tyria. These streams of magic are the leylines. And the Thama Nova reactor happened to sit at the intersection of two of these important channels. One of these channels emanates chaos magic, or at least there was a high concentration of chaos magic at the reactor. Chaos magic is the magic of portals, of warping. The Asura gates use chaos magic, and it ends up being sort of the magic of choice for synergetics research, because they're trying to understand a lot of these principles of portals and things like that. So the Inquest were attempting to study this at the reactor. They're attempting to study this chaos magic. However, they made an error in thinking that they were only studying chaos magic. Their reactor was also sitting on top of a channel of dragon magic. This mixture of chaos magic and dragon magic proved to be catastrophic when so much energy was concentrated in the reactor. So even though it may only seem interesting in the context of the Thama Nova reactor, the existence of chaos magic or dragon magic channels is a massive addition to our understanding of the lore. The idea that different channels of magic can interact and cause these crazy alterations in the fabric of reality, or can just result in these really dangerous situations, is very important. I recently released a video that traced one such channel by plotting out the source locations of creatures displaced by the Thama Nova reactor. You know, the Thama Nova reactor has all those creatures warping in and out, same with Toxelbog and stuff like that. And I was trying to map out where some of those more unique creatures were located elsewhere in the world to see if I could locate the path from which they came. I also plotted out some locations of otherworldly events events that really showcased instances where the fabric of reality had been breached in some way by spirits or underworld portals or any things like that. And in the video, I came up with a path and I sort of just gave up. I said, I don't know what this is about. It doesn't seem to lead anywhere. However, looking back at that image, I'll say now that the path actually led directly through the place of Primordus' awakening, central transfer chamber, in the depths of Tyria, where Primordus was first found when we thought he was a statue, but he was actually a dragon. That sort of place of slumber of Primordus, that path led straight through there. So there may be something to that. That may have actually been a channel of dragon magic. It's possible that this ley line that I mapped out was a channel of Primordus' dragon magic, and it was the source of the Thama Nova reactor's instability, as Scarlet alluded to. It's not really clear, but it's one way to think about it. Ultimately, the point is this. Chaos magic is what drives portals and Asuran gates. This is likely the same magic that would grant access to the eternal alchemy. However, when combined with dragon magic, very strange and very bad things happen. So if we think about places where it's particularly dangerous to have something like a Thama Nova reactor, a huge amount of chaos magic happening, it's important to know where the dragon ley lines are. One such area that likely sits on one of Primordus' ley lines of draconic magic is Radisum. It has historically had massive problems with Primordus minions, the Destroyers, and those problems persist even today. Historically in Guild Wars 1, that was one of the major locations of Destroyer attacks, so it's very likely that that area in general has a high concentration of Primordus' dragon magic, so it's something to keep in mind. So if anyone were to, say, mix a high level of tuned, concentrated chaos magic in Radisum, they would likely run into some problems, because that area sits on top of highly concentrated dragon magic. It's all about that mixing. It's all about the mixing of those magics that creates problems. That leads us to the Thaumanova headsplosion, the vision. What happened during the vision? What is it about the process of entering the eternal alchemy or entering that vision that leads to problems? Okay, so now we're ready to delve into Scarlet's point of corruption. I argue here that she became corrupted by Primordus while she was experiencing her escape into the eternal alchemy. When we talk about the eternal alchemy, we usually also talk about chaos magic because it's the basis for portals and warping, as I said before. We see this in the Chaos Crystal Caverns and various places that talk about Asura Gates. Different NPCs will talk about chaos magic or things like that. This chaos magic, then, is likely the magic utilized by Ahmad to send Sierra or Scarlet into the eternal alchemy. So when Ahmad comes back to Sierra at the time and says, "Hey, come back to Radasum. I just built this device. It's ready to go. We're ready to check out the eternal alchemy. I need you to be the one to test it." They go and Ahmad powers it through chaos magic, through how you would normally power a device, and they start it up. Now, normally if you were just in a place with chaos magic, using Ahmad's device probably would not have been an issue. I mean, to the extent that exploring the eternal alchemy is not a big deal, even though it's basically the most important experiment ever. Usually it's not a big deal to just have a high concentration of chaos magic anywhere to power whatever you're trying to do. However, just like with the Thaumanova reactor, if Radasum lies on a draconic ley line, and specifically one related to Primordus, then that would create complications for anyone daring enough to tamper with high levels of chaos magic, as Scarlet and Ahmad were doing in an effort to explore this eternal alchemy. I'm saying that in harnessing the eternal alchemy with finely tuned chaos magic, Scarlet was also affected by Primordus' overlapping draconic magic. She was then persuaded, or rather corrupted, to follow Primordus' goals. By entering or using the eternal alchemy from her location, which was saturated in Primordus' magic, she inadvertently simultaneously tuned in, I say that in quotes, sort of tuned in to Primordus' frequency, allowing them to engage and kind of exchange. This is the moment in which she is corrupted. How does this happen? Well, there's evidence from the personal story that it's simply a power supply issue. In the Asuran Infinity Ball story, you test the Infinity Ball while it's not supercharged. Usually you would supercharge it to get to see the alternative realities. That's with the steam creatures. So there's a part in the personal story where the Infinity Ball is not supercharged and you try to use it. In this case, instead of warping in steam creatures, like in the supercharged cases, you instead warp in destroyers. They're kind of special versions of destroyers, but dragon minions nonetheless, and Primordus' minions no less. It's possible that there's something like a spectrum or minimal point of power input that is needed to reach the level of breaching space and time, as Scarlet was trying to do. And if that amount of power is not supplied, if you don't supercharge it to reach that level of breaching space and time, you instead tap into the dragon magic that is located there. It's possible that Ahmad simply made the same mistake we did in the personal story and didn't supply enough energy to Sierra or Scarlet's chamber. So instead of accessing the eternal alchemy, she ended up saturated in Primordus' magic and had what she thinks was some sort of vision of whatever, and instead was totally guided by Primordus' own intents there. They needed more power, and I don't think that they had it. Getting such a strong power source while remaining inconspicuous is a pretty tough thing to do. Even though we find a way to do it in the personal story, you still have to jump through a lot of hoops, and it's really hard to be secret about it. Ultimately, this error led to Scarlet's corruption. But here's the thing. We know, in quotes, we know, supposedly, that Sylvari cannot be corrupted by elder dragons. Here's where we have to kind of reach a little bit farther. I'm gonna talk about different reasons why it's possible, but it's still up to you to decide how you feel about this. Okay, We know, supposedly, Sylvari can't be corrupted by elder dragons. However, the magical and biological mechanisms that prevent this corruption remain unknown. In other words, we think Sylvari are immune to corruption, but we don't know why. In this case, I think it's plausible to think that the Pale Tree's dream, the kind of connection, the sort of collective conscious, or the thing that links all Sylvari together, what they call that subtle empathy or that warmth, the Pale Tree's dream acts as a shield to corruption. This dream that binds them all together also incidentally prevents a dragon's corruption. Even the Nightmare Court, even with the Nightmare Court's hatred towards the Pale Tree, they are still connected and cannot be corrupted by dragons. And the Soundless, the Sylvari that suppress the dream by meditation, are still protected. They never fully cut themselves off. They can't. So they're still connected. However, if a Sylvari actually became solidly disconnected from the dream, then they might become vulnerable to such corruption. So where do we find examples of this disconnection? Well, Malik was such a Sylvari, as far as we know. He wasn't corrupted, but it certainly seemed that he was not part of a dream. He would have been the optimal test subject for such a topic, but ultimately we don't know his fate. He could be one to be corrupted at some point, but he left and we don't know anything about him. Another place to look for this disconnection is actually from a Traveler in Lion's Arch. This Sylvari Traveler in Lion's Arch at the Gateway Hub mentions that for a second, she is disconnected from the dream when she walks through a gate. She's completely cut off. That moment of passing through an Asura gate sends you through something that disconnects you from anything of this world for that split second, that moment. This is a unique occurrence of disconnection from the dream. I mean, the dream even persists in the mists. That is, it's not like the Sylvari are all disconnected from the dream when they're in world versus world, like there's still that connection. So there's that slight moment where you feel disconnected as a Sylvari. It's that moment of being in that rift that disconnects us. If the Pale Tree's collective dream acts as a shield against draconic influence, then that moment of disconnection can be a point of vulnerability. Okay, hold on to that thought for a moment. About this particular moment of disconnection, there's a concept from Guild Wars 1 called the Rift that highlights the potential mechanism that Scarlet and Omad were exploiting to access the eternal alchemy. This wiki entry for the Rift reads as follows. In the middle of the mists is a spot where time moves neither forward nor back. It is a tear in the fabric of the cosmos, the point of perfect balance between all forces of this universe. This place is known as the Rift, and there is nothing to which it does not connect, nothing that cannot be reached from inside it. Those who have the know-how to travel across the universe through the mists must pass through the Rift on their way to all other places. It is the center of all things. Okay, so that's the Rift. Via Asura gates and other portal technology, it's possible that the moment of passing through the Rift is that moment of disconnection. It's possible then that Scarlet not only passed through this Rift in her vision, but that she spent a prolonged amount of time in this Rift. In Scarlet's vision, the Pale Tree tries to talk her out of her course of action, but Scarlet decides to dive into this Rift after their exchange that they have. In any other situation of gate traveling, a Sylvari is only disconnected for a split second, which is likely much too short of a span to be corrupted. But what if they spent days in such a state, as Scarlet did? This might have been enough time for Primordus to persuade or recruit Scarlet to do his bidding. Now, this is not the only way in which she could have been corrupted, it's simply one way. For all we know, there's some alternative reason, possibly even related to Kate's secret, that Scarlet talked about in the Twilight Arbor Aether Path. So there's kind of a few ways to build that moment of corruption. This is the way that I found, this is the way that I feel like has the most support behind it. A lot of really concrete kind of NPC accounts, a lot of wiki accounts of the nature of the magic. So I feel like this is a pretty good setup for how it works, but there are other ways to do it. And it might, if we're saying it's not corruption, it could just be sort of a persuasion or Primordus is tricking Scarlet. But I do think there are some hints of actual corruption here. So let's go into those. Let's talk about those hints of corruption. In the story, Scarlet displays many moments of potentially corrupted behavior. For example, she says that she will watch continents burn. That was part of her little monologue. She will watch continents burn. Further, she says that when the conflagration is over, blah, 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 blah. Conflagration is a massive fire that produces a lot of destruction, deals a lot of damage. It's a huge fire. Then, after she awakens, Ahmad places his hand on her to see if she's okay and reflexively pulls away because Scarlet is hot to the touch. I don't think any other Sylvari has had that physiological reaction. Her skin actually burned him slightly. So that's a really interesting kind of physiological response that we don't see anywhere else. She was actually literally hot. Lastly, when she wakes up, she breaks through her head and armor strengths with little effort. Somehow she gained immense strength during that vision, that journey that she just had. Reminds me a lot of sort of a corrupted minion becoming stronger with a dragon's magic, for example. So those are the hints of Scarlet's own corruption. Now that she's corrupted and she's been recruited as a lieutenant of Primordus, now it's time to carry out his orders. Primordus tasks Scarlet to produce minions that can be born powerful, rather than having to mature into powerful minions. This ultimately is the premise for the collection of alliances. Even though it seems like there are disparate themes among the alliances, the lab at the top of the Tower of Nightmares gives us some insights as to what exactly is going on. You know, sort of what each alliance is contributing. Then we start seeing evidence of Scarlet doing a lot of hybridization, a lot of splicing together of different properties onto different beings, suggesting some kind of fusion or imbuing of fire-related things to her minions, or I don't want to say minions, to the Alliance members. In particular, of the Toxic Alliance, we see the husks that she recruited, the husks that she was in charge of. We now, once we started the Tower of Nightmares, one of the first minions I saw was a fire-touched husk. I think it was called a fire-touch, maybe flame-touched, something like that. And it was a husk. And it wasn't just like a toxic husk that does poison damage or anything like that. It was actually a husk that has been imbued with fire magic and deals fire damage. Very, very interesting. There's also, at the top of the Tower of Nightmares in the lab, we see this fire-resistant pod, this fire-resistant spore, suggesting that she was testing a new way to provide a shell that makes Primordus' heat tolerable, perhaps. You know, if this tree is a factory for producing these new minions, and you're trying to produce minions that have fire imbued into them or have some sort of molten core to them, or just that your base is going to be in a molten area, let's say, you need your factory, your plants, to survive such an environment. And so you need to test them against fire, against heat, to make sure that they can withstand such an environment. So those events, those facts can be interpreted as being related to Primordus and the plans that could be coming up. Okay, so that's that. Now, I want to talk about the ultimate product of the alliances. What were they all there for? It's important to note that the alliances are not the minions that Scarlet is amassing. I'm not saying Primordus needs an army and then Scarlet goes out and recruits the Aether Blades and the Molten Alliance and the Toxic. No, it's not like that. They are a means to an end. The alliances are more like employees rather than minions. They don't know exactly what Scarlet's end goal is, they just take orders. Scarlet has scared them into working with her. I can't remember if they say this in one of the stories, or if the writers were talking about it in a podcast, but the alliances don't actually like Scarlet. They're either tricked or intimidated by her, so they comply. Now, the ultimate product of these alliances was the Toxic Hybrid. So far, I mean, there's more, we have more coming up, but so far, it all culminated in the birth of this Toxic Hybrid. Each alliance contributed its own skills and equipment to the final production of the Toxic Hybrid. I won't go into details here, but the puzzle at the top of the tower describes how each alliance contributed to the creation of the Toxic Hybrid. There's a lot of detail there. And in that puzzle, every alliance or race is essentially accounted for except for the crate, What were they necessary for? Now, they were partly involved in the building of the tower, but really their main focus seemed to be basically filling out the body for the toxic hybrid. Well, the Krait as a race have the property of rapid evolution. It's not really a feature shown in Guild Wars 2, but in Guild Wars 1, a Krait would start out as an immature Neos, and then in battle would morph or evolve into a different form. Scarlet needed the ability of rapid evolution for the eventual minions to mature quickly after birth. Moreover, this rapid evolution into multiple classes, as we see in Guild Wars 1, that a Neos, if you start out as a Neos, you could mutate into a different class depending on what you wanted. This ability suggests a very flexible genetic structure, which would allow Scarlet to imbue them with her desired features. I just want to add some miscellaneous details from the Nightmare Tower, the Tower of Nightmares rather, that corroborate this idea. First, we see that Scarlet began fusing elemental properties onto the Toxic Alliance. We see the fire-infused husks show up for the first time in the tower. They do burning damage. Scarlet notes in the abandoned lab that she was trying to find a surrogate for aspects of air magic that we saw in the Zephyr Sanctum. Remember, the Aether Blades, what they were known as Sky Pirates back then, they showed up at the Zephyr Sanctum. For what reason, we don't know. They had a crashed ship. The idea was that they just looted Lion's Arch or something, and they were leaving, and their ship crashed with a bunch of loot. But I think they were there to collect information about air magic. I mean, Scarlet wouldn't be talking about air magic if she didn't find something out at the Zephyr Sanctum and through those crystals and things like that. The idea of aspects. Remember in the Zephyr Sanctum when you're doing something like Sanctum Sprint or whatever, or climbing up the Labyrinth Cliffs, when you engage with one of those crystals, you are imbued with multiple properties of that magic. So it's all under the umbrella of air magic, but you can be, I think it was like sun, lightning, wind, things like that, and each crystal would imbue you with different properties. Well, there were a very limited amount of crystals, so if you look in the Tower of Nightmares in the lab, and she says, well, what's just as effective as air magic? Well, a certain alchemy seems to be just as effective as air crystals, so she doesn't have air crystals, but she knows a lot about a certain alchemy, and so she used that instead. There's a lot of evidence for kind of not being able to get something, so she uses a surrogate technique or something like that to get things that she doesn't really have access to. So that her research into air magic suggests that she was trying to imbue someone, likely the toxic hybrid, with different attributes, different features, different elemental features. Also in the puzzle was a dried out toxic spore that had been tested against fire. Its description reads, "This toxic spore pod appears different than the others. Its tougher hide is unyielding. A closer inspection reveals signs of prior experimentation. It appears Scarlet was trying to hybridize a more resilient casing. This pod's casing is cool to your touch and seems to react ever so slightly to your body heat." There are many ways to interpret this point. Perhaps she's trying to grow more towers but produce a strand that will be protected against fire. Or this could be the origins of something like a carapace for her upcoming minions. The destroyers generally have carapace-like armor, and maybe this is the origin of that. I'm not sure what the ultimate purpose of this pod is, but it certainly seems important for protecting its core from the heat. Okay, so given all that evidence, I think it's reasonable, at least, to entertain the idea that Scarlet is a champion of Primordus. And if we think about Primordus' motives, that he's trying to attack Tyria, and Primordus recruited Scarlet, she was very competent, she knew what she was doing, she knew how to produce minions that he was looking for because he was already trying to innovate that and trying to produce powerful minions. And we see evidence of Scarlet not only producing new minions, but that a lot of these minions are fused with fire, that a lot of the other things she's been working on have been tested against fire. So it's a really interesting perspective to take when thinking about Scarlet kind of through the lens of Primordus' campaign. Okay, so if we take that to be what's happening, then what does the big finale look like? What are the final things that are going to happen in the upcoming month or two? that close out this season of the Living Story. Well, before any dragons show up, we'll find Scarlet's secret base in the islands, in quotes. If you don't know, Agent Frovik at Thunder Ridge Camp says that this is a conversation you can only have if you're with the Order of Whispers. Agent Frovik says that the Order of Whispers has been tracking Scarlet, and she's been seen near the islands. Very cryptic, no one knows exactly what they're talking about, and that she's trying to set up a base or a factory there. The islands may be I think this would be awesome, and I think this is what they're going to do, is the islands are referring to the upcoming Edge of the Mists world versus world map. You know, Scarlet being so interested in the mists, and in the mists, a lot of the areas that we're able to explore there are referred to as islands, because they're sort of land masses that are floating on their own among the mists. And given the shape of the Edge of the Mists map, those really take on kind of island-style forms. So I think that's a top contender for where she's going to be at. And it would be really interesting. It'd be a really cool way to introduce that content, because then they could introduce it as a living story piece where it's Scarlet's base. And then once we kill Scarlet and we take out the factories or whatever that are there, it can be, you know, sort of like, great, we've killed Scarlet. Okay, what happens with this piece of land? Well, this piece of land now becomes contested with other worlds, you know, so then it becomes a world versus world kind of map. So I think that'd be cool. That might be a thing. I mean, given that we're talking about Primordus, and Primordus's element is molten, rock, fire, all these things, it would make sense to have something like a volcano setting. And when I say volcano, I know a lot of alarms are going to go off for people. Well, it's definitely not going to be Mount Maelstrom, so what's the only other volcano that we really know of? Well, that's the Ring of Fire Island chain in the southwest corner of the map, where it has a lot of history attached to it, but that might be something. It's islands, it's molten, Primordus, possibly. I don't think that's the case. I think it would be cool if that was the case, but I don't think it is, because I think that there's actually an even better location for Primordus right now, given the... And what I'm talking about is the area northwest of Divinity's Reach. If you look at the map, just for a few facts that kind of point me there, is first the Great Collapse. There was structural instability in where we now have the Queen's Pavilion. Before that, we had this giant sinkhole that happened because of structural instabilities underneath Divinity's Reach in that district. People, if you talk to NPCs around Divinity's Reach, some of them will attribute this to like sewer drakes or underground drakes or something like that no one has ever seen, but it's like sort of speculated that that's what it is. It could have been Primordus on his sort of flight path or whatever, and it led to some kind of structural instability underneath Divinity's Reach. It could have been his destroyers, many things like that. And that's not the only thing. So it could have been something like that. And then if you also just look at the map, in the northwest, just in that area in general, if we think about kind of the history, think about the time between Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2. If you look at the maps, that area of the map used to be not totally Maguma jungle type forest, but it was like green, it was like greenish, sort of brown too, some dry areas as well. Now it's mostly brown and even like orange. So it's possible that it's really sort of like a scorched land, sort of like Fireheart Rise almost, where the land is scorched, it's molten even. So that could be a region. And even not just that, but the water, the water surrounding Divinity's Reach has even changed since Guild Wars 1. And I don't think it's from the tidal wave from Zaitan, from the Rising of Ore. That tidal wave didn't reach that far. So I don't think it was the tidal wave that caused any changes in the water surrounding Divinity's Reach. The reason why I bring this up is because if you look at Guild Wars 1 map versus Guild Wars 2 map, the water level has gone down significantly because you see land masses in that water that were not there before. So why has the water level gone down so much? Maybe because it's warmer in the area. Maybe the ground underneath that body of water has been warmer and so more water is evaporating. I don't know. I don't know if they really put that much thought into it. I think they would actually, but I'm not sure how reasonable that is. But all those things taken together, lead me to think that it's actually a better contender than Ring of Fire Islands, because that's even more out of nowhere. And I'm certainly not the first one to say that Divinity's Reach and the areas surrounding Divinity's Reach is a location for Primordus. People have said that for a while now, so that might be a contender. Okay, just a recap and a wrap up. Just to recap, Scarlet was searching for a way to harness the eternal alchemy. She and her mentor Ahmad thought that they might have figured out how to do that. In the process of accessing the eternal alchemy, a miscalculation led to Scarlet being vulnerable and exposed to dragon magic, specifically the magic of Primordus. Therefore, instead of harnessing the eternal alchemy, she instead became corrupted by Primordus. Primordus has been planning a comeback, and now he has his general. In the personal story, we saw that Primordus has been experimenting with new ways of corruption and minion creation. In particular, corruption from birth, through incubation, as we saw with the hatching destroyer crablings. Scarlet was brought on to amass an army for Primordus, one that would be born both extremely powerful and corrupted. Scarlet's alliances have all been formed for the sake of reaching this goal. Part of her campaign so far has been to cause chaos around Tyria, keeping our forces occupied and disorganized. Moreover, each alliance contributes to the formation of this new minion that she's creating, as we see from the puzzle in her abandoned lab at the top of the Nightmare Tower. With the Do Not Touch thumpers around Tyria, now known as mysterious probes, we may have Scarlet trying to combine old and new minions of Primordus to destroy Tyria. Destroyers from the depths will rise to the surface, guided by these Do Not Touch towers, and Scarlet will provide the new crate-like destroyer that she's producing. As she said, she will watch continents burn. Okay, that's the recap. I want to finish off with just some limitations. We always have to acknowledge the limitations of our theories. This is sort of like directions for future research. These are limitations. We need to make sure we clear these up if we want to expand on this theory a little bit more. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the biggest hurdle of the theory is that it claims corruption of a Sylvari, which is counter to a characteristic that we hold as fact. We say Sylvari cannot be corrupted, generally. In my theory, though, I think of Scarlet's corruption as a very unique case that only happens under the most extreme of circumstances. This is something that would never happen to anyone else because no Sylvari would ever get caught in this situation again. Scarlet was like a super genius. She had the right connections. She had someone set her up, hook her up to this machine so she could dive into the eternal alchemy. No one else, especially now that Scarlet has gone through this, no one will ever give a Sylvari another chance like that. This is a very unique case. So even though it's a limitation to say that it happened, I think there are so many ways to make it happen, for the writers to sort of make it happen, that I think it's okay for it to happen just this once. But I don't know. It's still a limitation. Perhaps there's another way that it happened. Another way to work around the corruption issue is that perhaps she wasn't corrupted at all, but merely tricked or influenced by Primordus' magic. It could be that the magic of Primordus tainted Scarlet's vision and convinced her that this was the correct course of action. There are actually many ways to work this into the story, but I chose corruption instead. And I think the little symptoms or pieces of evidence of corruption that I presented were pretty good too. About the Do Not Touch thumpers, we actually don't know if the Do Not Touch thumpers are even part of this living story arc. We think they belong to Scarlet because of the message that popped up when they first appeared. It said something along the lines of, "Tisk tisk, mind your own beeswax," something like that, which seems like a very Scarlet thing to say. And even if they do belong to Scarlet, we don't know their true purpose yet. Koenig on the forums brought up an interesting alternative to the thumpers, which is that they might belong to the Order of Whispers. Fitting with my own theory, perhaps they've caught wind of Scarlet's motives and are trying to seek out the locations of Primordus with those devices. Yeah, it's kind of up in the air. We're not really sure. I do think, along with many others, that they belong to Scarlet. If they are part of the next story arc, it seems just a little bit early to introduce them, so I'm not sure. So, everyone, thank you so much for listening. I absolutely welcome any comments, any critiques, any holes that you can find in the theory. I really do try to find as much concrete evidence in the game. This is one interpretation of the evidence that we find in the game. I'm sure there are multiple variations of this same theory, and then other theories that are totally different, as we've seen with things like the Mordramoth theory, the jungle dragon theory, you know, and some other ones that are out there as well. Thank you guys so much for listening, watching, and paying attention. I will see you guys next time. Bye. 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 Bye.